Thanks for attending this evening. For those who haven't met me before, my name is Nick Randolph. I'm here today to talk to you about Windows Phone and developing for Windows Phone. So prior to going live, we were just having a bit of hands in the air about who's running Windows Phone versus iOS and other devices. What I'd actually like to see is just a raise of hands for the people who have actually started building across Windows Phone and or other platforms. So mobile developers in the room. Okay, we've got a couple, okay, for the benefit of those on the live stream. Today we're going to talk about Windows Phone and I guess look at the whole ecosystem around Windows Phone development from sort of getting started, what you need to know, through to actually cutting some code. And then we'll talk about what you can do in terms of cross-platform, both around the Windows ecosystem, so both Windows and Windows Phone, but also about the other platforms, okay? Clearly in the current market, particularly in Australia, Windows Phone is a very small percentage of the market. So if you're going to invest your skills and your time into building for Windows Phone, you want to make use of those skills across other platforms in the Windows or the Microsoft ecosystem. So reusing that same code for building for Windows, which you can do. Or you want to go the other direction and actually leverage that same code base across the other mobile platforms. So taking advantage of some of the tools that are freely available, that are freely or for paid available that can enable you to do cross-platform development using C# or using your web development skills. So we'll talk about those towards the end of the presentation as well. Short and narrow, so what we're going to cover today, so we're going to talk in brief about design. So we'll talk about Windows Phone design and I guess where Microsoft differentiates itself from some of the other platforms. And from there, it will lead into a discussion about the importance of XAML and why it definitely gives Windows Phone and Windows developers the edge over building for other platforms. We'll talk about the tools that are available as part of the SDK and I guess the tools that you should be aware of in terms of how you go about building applications for Windows Phone. We'll talk about the store and I guess some of the requirements around packaging your application for the store, and so, again, some of the tools that are available to help you along the way so that you don't have to go through the store certification process multiple times. And then from there on, we'll talk about the cross-platform story. So looking at Windows versus Windows Phone, what the differences and what the similarities are there. We'll talk about code reuse, again, across those two platforms. And then we'll look at the cross-platform story across both the Windows ecosystem and the other platforms. So design. The metaphor for a lot of what happens on Windows Phone is driven from Microsoft going out into the real world and looking around at transportation hubs. So if you go to a bus stop or you go to a train station, look around, you'll quite often see very, very clear signs, okay? So at 100 meters, you can tell from what a sign says, both from the icons that they use and also the lettering and the typography that they use, okay? They make it very clear, very easy to glance up at something, get the gist of what's being communicated, and get on with what you need to do, okay? So that's one of the underlying philosophies of Windows Phone, is this concept of glance and go. So some of the early ads that you would have seen around Windows Phone was literally guy pulls out a phone out of his pocket, flicks it open, glances at it, and then puts it back into his pocket. So that was one of the initial marketing campaigns around Windows Phone, concept of glance and go. And that sort of concept leads itself to this very flat tile-based interface that we see on Windows Phone today. Okay, and actually, as we go into the Windows ecosystem, again, you see those big bold tiles. We see very flat styles where we don't see gradients, we don't see drop shadows, those types of things. Okay, and that's not to say that you can't use those, but the core platform is designed in a certain way that it doesn't use those inherently. And as part of building out Windows Phone, and now with the advent of other platforms or other parts of the ecosystem using it, so we're seeing this around Windows, we're seeing it around the direction of Xbox and Media Center, we're starting to see some design principles that get applied when we're actually building out our applications. Okay, so some of these are pride in craftsmanship. The history of sort of Windows Mobile got tarnished somewhat by the integration between what Microsoft would produce and what the OEMs and then third-party developers would produce. And quite often what you ended up there was it was a device that was inherently slow, it was painful to use, and the user experience really was degraded. Okay, so pride in craftsmanship is really about building and focusing on the user experience on the device. Increasingly what we're seeing is that users will open an application, if it stops responding, if it crashes, if it does something that they don't particularly like, they'll either close the app and never use it again, or they'll do uninstall straight away. Okay, so if you want your application to be successful, you really need to take pride in what you do. Okay, and that means looking at and focusing on the attention of detail. So that's the number one thing that you've got to take into it. Don't publish an application that's not done, or that you haven't done a serious amount of work to actually get it to a point where you're happy with it, okay? And hopefully your end customers will be happy with it too. The concept of doing more with less, okay? So rather than putting frilly borders on things and try and put as much as you can on the screen, just think about how you can space things out and actually let things flow and breathe and allow the user to see the relevant information for where they are or what they're interested in. Focusing on fast and fluid, one of the really nice things we've got as packaged apart with the XAML, coupled with a really good design tool in Expression Blend, we've got this ability to rapidly build out interfaces. Now what this means is that we spend less time writing code to actually build out a basic user interface, and we can focus more time on building out some of the really nice animations and the really nice effects of transitioning between pages, okay? Don't use these gratuitously. Don't have a little bouncing ball that sits in the bottom right-hand corner, because you're still chewing through CPU cycles. You don't get anything for free these days, okay? So having bouncing animations on the screen is going to chew through CPU and battery life and things like that. But use animation to actually convey meaning, to actually give your application the feel of it being alive. So going between pages, if you get the nice turnstile animation as you go from one page to another, that just enhances the feel of your application. And the really nice thing about that is NuGet, add reference to the Silverlight toolkit, or it's now called the Windows Phone toolkit. Okay, once you've got that, you can literally add a transition or page transition in like one line of code that gives you that turnstile behavior between pages. Okay, it's really simple to add, and it's something that differentiates an average application from a really good application. Being authentically digital, and the last two of the points here are a little bit markety-ish in the sense of, you know, authentically digital, what does that really mean, okay? The idea behind this is don't try to be what you're not, okay? Don't try to have a 3D button, because you're on a flat screen, okay? So the principles of it being flat and it not having to look like it's an actual physical button means that we can actually spend less time, again, on trying to make things look like what they're not, and we can spend more time on actually building out our application. And the last one is Winners One. And this kind of says, tries to encourage people to adopt these design philosophies and actually build your application so it looks like it's part of the platform. Now, talking to people who, I think it's Words with Friends or one of those other popular games that's come across from other platforms, has appeared on Windows Phone. It looks exactly the same as it does on an iPhone or an Android device. And the frustrating thing is it doesn't look like it belongs on the platform. So yes, great, we have that application or that game running on the platform. Does it play in with the way that we expect it to on Windows Phone? No, not really. Is it a great user experience? No, not really. So a little bit more attention to detail on there. They could have flattened the gradients. They could have done just very small things to make it look like it belongs on the platform. And all of a sudden users go, oh, that's nice. That's a really good user experience. So actually thinking about how you can make minor changes to your application, assuming it's on other platforms, to bring it to Windows Phone and make it look like it belongs on the platform will yield a good result in terms of a user adoption. So we talked a little bit about the sort of the theoretical side of things. If we start to look at the practical side of designing for Windows Phone, some of the core differentiators of Windows Phone is this idea of the panorama and the pivot controls. Okay, so these are two controls that are relatively unique to Windows Phone. What's interesting about this is that since the advent of this panorama style control, where we've got a fairly wide display that actually wraps around and actually allows users to scroll left and right, with the advent of this, what we saw was actually the number of iPhone apps that actually started making use of left-right scrolling to actually display more content and actually have sort of galleries of things, all of a sudden started to go up. I mean, prior to that, we really didn't see very many iPhone apps that had horizontal scrolling. They had a lot of them, it was like list after list, and they had some tab displays and things like that. But you very rarely got this sort of carousel kind of behavior. Introduce Windows Phone, all of a sudden we've got this sort of panoramic experience, and all of a sudden a number of app developers go, oh wow, we can do this, and even if they had to put a lot of effort into it, which they did initially on the iPhone, they started to build out some more creative user experiences. So due credit to the Windows Phone team, they actually sort of led the market in terms of actually trying to encourage people to think about beyond vertical scrolling. And if you look at the Windows space, we're starting to see that. So on the start screen, and if you look at the store, the default behavior on the mouse when you scroll it actually scrolls left and right. Okay, so it's a little bit counterintuitive for most people. They think the scrolls are going to go up and down, but once you get used to it, actually a really nice user experience, and you get really quick with it as well. The other control that's unique to Windows Phone is this concept of a pivot. Now, what's interesting here is that people, when they start to use the pivot control, think, oh, it's just a tab control. It's not really designed that way. And actually, if you try to use it as a tab control, it kind of breaks down, because a tab control, if you look at the way it is featured on most iOS or Android applications, is really about dividing your application up into a number of core chunks, and you divide those by the tab bar. And as you tab between those, you're effectively going off into that part of the application. And then you might tab to another part and you go off into that part. With the pivot control, it's really designed to split out a single data set over multiple dimensions. So the canonical example I often use is if you do a search for property listings, you might get that result back, and there may be 300 results, of which you're only ever going to look at the first 20. But you may be interested in sorting them in different orders, right? So it may be listing date, it may be price, it may be suburb. Each of those would be a good candidate for a pivot item. Okay, so you might have 4 or 5 pivot items which sort the results by suburb, by price, by listing date, those types of things. But it's the one data set that you're just splitting different ways. Another example is if you look at, for example, here on the screen, you can actually see an appointment has been displayed in a pivot. So it's a single appointment, but it's broken down into details and the attendees. Okay, the same is true of the contacts. Okay, so a contact we've broken down using a pivot, which has got their main details, and then it's got other information about them. So like what's been happening with them recently, a history of your call logs with them, those types of things. Okay. The other thing that's on the screen at the bottom here is actually just some other examples of the core interfaces within Windows Phone. So on the left there, you can see the start screen, very iconic, very Windows centric. So across both Windows 8 and Windows Phone, we now have this concept of tiles, and they're supposed to represent more than just links through to your application. They're really designed to be content-driven units. Okay, so the idea is that good applications will actually start to update or drive content to those live tiles that's contextual to where the user is, right? So it may be location driven, it may be the number of updates that have been unread. So you can see in the example there's 2 missed phone calls, 3 messages, and 20 unread emails. Okay, so it's very quick for me to pull that out, look at it, and get an idea of where I am or what I've got to follow up on. Okay. Increasingly, we're starting to see developers take advantage of that and surface up much more information. One of the big changes that happened with Windows Phone 8 is that we've actually got support for not just the regular square tile, we've now got the full width tiles, and we've now got a much smaller tile as well. Okay, so that again allows the user to put more on their screen and focus on what's important to them. So I, for one, have I've got 2 wide tiles that represent the calendar appointments and some other things, but then the rest of the applications I've got there are literally just small tiles, because it's either I don't use that application very often, or it's an application that doesn't actually make use of those live tiles, so there's no point in me having it full screen on the device. That said, if you build an application that's readily going to make use of live tiles, you should be promoting it within your application. So you should be encouraging the developers to pin parts of your application. If you can pin to the start screen, it's going to encourage the user to go back into your application more. And obviously, getting users to spend more time in your application is what it's all about. Okay. The reality is that most applications, after they get downloaded and installed on a device, get used. They might get used for the first couple of days, but then if they're not a Facebook or they're not a LinkedIn or they're not your email, chances are that after the first couple of days, they're not going to get used. Okay, so it's really important to think about how you can get traffic back into your application. Okay, one caveat to all of that discussion about design is I'm not a designer, okay? So I know a couple of really good design people who have lent me some content and some slides there, but what I do, I'm a developer at heart, right? And traditionally that's meant writing C# code, okay? Increasingly, I probably spend probably 60% of my time writing XAML. And actually of that 60%, I probably spend about 40% of it in Blend, laying things out, and then I actually spend probably, maybe 20% of that 60% actually writing XAML code. So very little time spent actually writing XAML code. The rest of it is actually in Blend laying things out. Okay. So XAML's had a bit of a history. It's been around for several sort of generations. We've had WPF, Silverlight, Windows Phone, and now Windows 8. And actually, if you look at some of the development environments for the Xbox, some of that was XAML driven as well. So it's not a new thing. Unfortunately, we haven't had much continuity in the XAML, so every sort of breed of XAML is slightly different, and the reuse of that XAML is a little bit hard to do. So for example, you can't literally take something built for WPF and actually use it unchanged within Silverlight, Windows Phone and Windows 8. And even between sort of Windows Phone and Windows 8, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, the compatibility issues that we have between those is predominantly around the use of XAML, okay? And so we'll come back to that in a bit. So what's XAML about? It's primarily about declaring our layout rather than having to write it line by line of code. Okay, create me a grid. Okay, create me a text box. Okay, we don't want to have to write that line by line because it means that firstly we're writing lines of code instead of actually going to the design surface and laying things out. Okay. Historically, the problem we had with, say, Windows Forms development is that whilst we did have a Forms designer, it was very brittle. And as you started to write some code against it, the round tripping between the design surface and actually the code ended up degrading, and all of a sudden you may as well throw the design surface away and start writing things by hand again. With XAML, predominantly, we've got a really good round tripping story. So the designer doesn't typically clobber the code that you've written and vice versa. So that's one of the advantages of using XAML. The other advantage is it is designed so that tools can work with it, okay? You should not have to write line-by-line codes of XAML, okay? If you have to write lines of code of XAML, it means that you haven't spent enough time learning Blend, okay? So if you spend all of your time writing XAML, hint, take a week out of your life and learn Blend. And yes, it does take that. Even if you spread that week over the period of a couple of years like I did, cumulatively, it all adds up to at least a week's worth of learning in Blend, okay? And unfortunately, as developers, we're fairly uncomfortable in Blend because everything's the other way around. Like even the choice of where they position the tool windows is on the other side. The choice of colors, okay? There is a tool option that you can change the colors, but the default of black is not what we're used to. We're used to like a white screen, okay? So everything about it is designed so that it's designed for designers, right? Rather than us developers, okay? Give you a hint, get familiar with Blend because it will be well worth the time and the investment. The other thing that the XAML gives us is a really good data binding framework, okay? If you are writing lines of code that go textbox.text equals blah, okay, chances are you're doing it wrong, okay? You should nearly never have to write, and I will say nearly never, not never, because there are some cases like the map control, for example, where you actually have to write line by line of code to work with the map control. Okay, that's just because the people who designed the map control didn't understand this concept of data binding, or they couldn't get it to work in a performant way. Okay. If, however, you're just working with text boxes or text elements or buttons, you should be using data binding to update all of the items on the screen. And that includes list boxes, okay? So if you've got a list of items, you shouldn't be manually adding items into the list. You should literally be data binding to an observable collection and allowing that to flow from your code into the appropriate design. One of the really nice things supported in both Windows Phone and Windows 8 is this concept of visual states. Okay, so we might have a loading state, and then so we've got like a whizzing thing going around on the screen to indicate that something's loading, something's happening on the screen. And then once the data's loaded, we'll actually present the data on the screen. Okay, we can do those in XAML, and we've actually got really good support within Blend for actually showing those two visual states that we're actually designing in Blend. Nice thing is that in code, we basically have one line to switch between those two visual states. Once we have visual states, then we can actually put transitions and animations in to go from one visual state to another, okay? And this can all be done in Blend. And if you haven't got the hint already, it's all about Blend, okay? That's how we design our applications, or that's how we should be designing our application. And probably the most important or the most significant thing that people overlook all of the time is the use of design time data, okay? What does my application look like in Blend, okay? I don't want to know what it looks like on the emulator or the real device, because your design is not going to be sitting there having to press run every single time, okay? Or whoever's driving it in Blend. You don't want to have to press run in order to see what it looks like, okay? Every time you do that, there's a 20 to 30 second lag between when you've got something on the screen to when, as a minimum, to when it's running on the device or on the emulator, okay? You multiply that by the number of times you hit, run through the day, it adds up, right? So if you've got a good design experience on the screen and you don't have to keep on running it on the emulator or the device, you're going to be miles ahead at the end of the day. In case you missed the hint, it's all about Blend. Okay, right, my job here is done. Okay, so we're going to jump out and surprise, surprise, we're actually going to do a demo in Blend, okay? Now, there are some caveats to working with Blend, and the first one is that I never actually start a project in Blend. Blend, whilst it is really good as a design surface, it is also a tool designed for designers. And as such, it's got some quirks. And one of those is file management. It tends to throw things all over the place. So my usage of Visual Studio and Blend, and they do use the same files, okay? So they do both open solution and project files. They both have XAML files and C# files and image files and stuff like that. I always add files and remove files and create things in Visual Studio, and then I open them or update them in Blend. So we're going to go ahead and create a new project. Just as an aside, you'll see that there's a number of different Windows Phone templates that you can work with. I would encourage you to take a look at some of these if you haven't done Windows Phone development before. So for example, if you want to get started using the Panorama control, the Panorama app is a really good starting point to actually have a look at how the Panorama control works, and similarly with the pivot, or how data binding works using the data bound app. Big caveat here is I wouldn't use these as a starting point for your application. I would go and have a look at them, get familiar with it, work out how the control works, work out how the data binding works and things like that. But then put it to one side, just proper prototyping, put it to one side. Okay, I'm not going to play with that anymore. Create a new app based on the Windows Phone app template, or in the case of a class library, you can use the class library example there. Okay, you'll also notice that we get the option to do Windows Phone 7.1 and 8.0 apps. The compatibility story here is if you build a Windows Phone 8 app, you won't run on Windows 7X. And if you build a Windows 7X, you won't get the Windows 8 APIs, but you will be able to run across all of those devices. The other caveat to that is the only time that becomes a major problem is if you run a 7.0 app or 7.1 app on a Windows 8 device that is actually 720p. You actually see there's a black line across the top. So the way to get around that, because it's 16 by 9 as opposed to 15 by 9. So what they've done is they've assumed that your screen's not going to auto size, because when we were building for Windows 7.0 or 7.1, we only had a single screen size to work with. Now that we've got multiple screen resolutions to work with, the ones that auto scale, not a problem. The ones where it's slightly different aspect ratio, they've assumed that they're just going to put a black line in the top there to make sure that your application doesn't scale wrongly. So it's just something to be aware of if you do build a 7.1 application and assume that it's going to run across them. Yes, Adam?
Are you in presentation mode then?
I am not in presentation mode.
Can you do me a favour? Can you go up into the top? You know, there's a box in the top right. I can't see it from here. No, leave that.
Sorry. You want me to do this again?
It's just for the viewers and for the recording. It's difficult. In the very top right-hand corner, there should be a text box. Where's that text box gone? On the title bar.
It's beyond. It is there. We're actually trimming the top and the bottom in here, but online we're actually getting all of that.
Oh, right. So are you able to get to it? Just to type a word in there?
I am. Yes.
Okay. Just type PRESE. And you should be able to turn on present on or something.
Nope, not seeing any of that.
You can't turn.
I mean, I'm not going to spend that much time writing code, so
That's okay.
You can show me that trick afterwards.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so now that we've got our project, and for those who missed it, I did select a Windows Phone 8 project because nearly everything I do is around Windows Phone 8 these days. That said, there are still a large number of Windows Phone 7 devices in market, so if you're looking for broad adoption of your application, at least in the short term, you'd probably want to consider building for both. Okay, so same application, you can reference virtually the same files and just have hash defines to basically comment out the parts that are Windows 8 specific, so that they don't break your Windows 7 build, and then you can actually distribute two builds, and the marketplace is actually pretty good at handling that, so you can have a Windows Phone 7 and a Phone 8 build of your application to support the different users that you have out there. So
I'll tell you why it didn't work, just so you know. You don't have the productivity tools installed.
I do not have the productivity tools installed. You're correct. This machine actually runs slow enough now as it is without adding more things to the mix. Thank you for the contribution, Adam. Right, okay, so right ahead. We're going to switch and go and open this project straight in Blend. And just to reiterate that, the shortcut for it is right-click on the project, open in Blend within the Solution Explorer. And here you can see the outline of our Windows Phone application. Okay, for those who really like to keep an eye on what Blend does in XAML, and I'm one of those people, you can actually change the window to split mode. These icons in the top right-hand corner will switch between display and design only, code, and the split mode. So I nearly always leave my window in split mode. And Control-0 will actually resize the visuals so that it actually fits on the screen. The reason why I keep the XAML on view is if you've ever worked with a designer, they're really good at throwing shit on the screen, excuse the language, and just assuming that it's going to be great for developers. Now, the reality is that they end up generating a lot of stuff and it ends up being really slow and you know, you start moving things on the screen and you think, why is this not doing what I expect? It's because there's a ton of stuff there that the designer's gone, yep, okay, drag that button there. If you take a look at what the XAML is that Blend is creating, you can make sure that you refine it as you go. Okay, it's a mammoth task to go back to an application after you're ready to ship and go through the XAML and actually work out, okay, well, can I get rid of this height property? Can I get rid of this width property? Does that need to be there? Does that need to be there? If you keep an eye on the XAML that you're building along the way, it's a much quicker process to actually refine it at the end. Okay, and trust me, Blend will do all sorts of things to try and give you absolute positioning or absolute sizing on your elements as you go. For example, if I go across to my assets window and I grab a button and drop it on there, okay, you can see immediately that Blend has tried to be smart about it. Okay, it's given it a fixed position, so it's basically said, okay, well, I'm going to set the margin property and I'm going to set the alignment and all sorts of things on there. Really quick trick is basically if you click on it, on the element and go reset layout all, it actually will expand that item to take advantage of the available space. Okay, so here I've dropped this button into the grid. Okay, so you can see here this lower section is a single grid element, and I've dropped the button within it. By resetting the layout, I've assumed that it's going to take up the full screen. Okay, that's not exactly what I want, but it's pretty close. All I meant was for it to take up the horizontal bar at the top. Okay, so it's quite easy for me to generate some very minimal XAML in contrast to what Blend actually generated. Okay, so just keeping an eye on the XAML that it generates means that you can go, I don't like that, let me just refactor that a little bit as I go. Okay. The other thing I really like about Blend, and I reiterated on the slides there, was this ability to generate design time data. Okay, so Blend's really good if I've just got some some text elements there, and I want to go and set some properties on. So for example, my application, I can go and change this to SSW example. Okay, so I can change properties on the fly like that. If I want to reuse properties that I've set, I can basically create resources out of them. So I can go convert to new resource. Okay, so this is going to be my application title. Okay, boom, created as a resource. Now if I go to another element, I can say, okay, well actually I want to reuse that resource. Okay, so you can get some very high level reuse of things just by promoting them from individual properties to actually styles or to actually to resources and then reuse those through your application. Okay, all of that stuff's great, but where the real power of Blend comes in is when you start to use this concept of sample data. Okay, so this gives you the ability to create mock data that you're going to use within your application. I'll go and create some new sample data. There's a number of different ways to create this design time data. If you've already got a class library and you just want to generate some sample data based on that class structure, you can do that. If you've got an XML data feed or some example data, you can actually suck that in to Blend, and it will actually give you some design time data, some data based on that XML structure. In this case, I'm actually going to dissociate the classes that I'm going to build later on from what's actually going to be used in the design experience. And I do that for a couple of reasons. The current set of tools, if you base it on a class library or a set of classes, what you'll find is that the designer will then be constrained to only use those properties. Now that may work in your favor if you know that your class library only has these properties and only ever will have these, then that's great. If you actually want the designer to have some element of creativity, like restructuring things or designing the user experience based on properties that you might be able to source from somewhere else, limiting them to only those classes means that they have to go back to the developers and say, hey, I really need a property called title. Developer goes, yeah, I'll put that into my backlog. Okay, 3 days later he's created a title property, by which time the designer's gone, okay, well, actually I got around that by doing this. Okay, so it's really good actually separating the two, but it does introduce a little bit of checking that you have to do to make sure that your design time data is in sync with the class library you have. So when this dialog comes up to say, I'm going to create my sample data source here, it's got a couple of options here. I nearly always select the defined in project, okay, because it basically allows all of the design time data to be created at the project level. However, which is interesting because I create sample data for each one of my pages within my application. Okay, so whilst I do have it available across the application, I do that just so that at the end of the project I know exactly where all my design time data is being wired up, and I can go comment, end of story, and I can walk away, and I know that that design time data is not shipping with my application. Okay. The other thing that's on the screen is the ability to toggle whether the design time data will be used when the application is running. Okay, so for the time being, I'm going to leave that checked, and I'll show you what that checkbox or where that checkbox comes into play a bit later on. So we'll go ahead and create this sample data source, and by default, it creates me a collection of items. Okay, now it's a bit of an annoying property name that they've given it because they've called it a collection. Now most of us associate collection with being a type of object, so an observable collection, a list, a collection, right? You'd think it's just a type. It's actually not. This is the name of a property in your design time data. Okay, so I'm going to call this my images. And okay, so that's going to be the name of the property that I'm going to expose that I'm going to then data bind to. I've got two properties here, and these ones were named with a little bit more sense, okay, so they've indicated that they are properties that you're going to be exposing. What's a little hard to see from here until you're familiar with it is that these are properties that are going to exist on every single item in that collection. So if I actually look at the edit window for these sample data, you can actually see that there's property 1 and property 2 for each item in that sample data. Okay, so I can actually go in and edit those. I can make them look more realistic to my application. There's another way that you can do that. So I can say, change this to title, and on the right-hand side here, and I'll just resize this a little bit so that you can actually see the full width of it. Okay, so on the right-hand side, you can actually see that you can change the type of sample data that's being generated. So by default, this one's a string, and I can change it from being just a bit of random text to actually structure it to be a company name or an address or something that looks more specific to my application. So for the time being, we're just going to go with, let's say, company name, for example. Let's go and change the other property, and this is going to be my image URL, assuming that. And the type of this object is going to be an image. Now, it will automatically populate a set of sample images that ship with Blend. Okay, they happen to be chairs. If you've got images that are more specific to your application and you've got them sitting in a folder, so you might have gone to a website and just cut and paste them into a folder, you can actually select that folder and actually use that as the source folder to actually generate images. Okay, particularly good for actually generating a more realistic looking application. Okay, let's come over here and let's get rid of this button that I added before, and I'm going to literally drag this images collection across over to my design surface. For the benefit of those who can't read, which is probably nearly everyone because it's really small, it says, as the hyperlink there, it says create a list box, in brackets, so that's the type of object it's about to create, and bind its item source property to my images. Okay, so it's basically going to set up a list box for us. It's going to data bind the my images property of our sample data across to the item source property on the list box. Sounds pretty good to me. Okay, this is Blend doing its thing again. It's basically saying, okay, well, rather than taking up all of the available space, I'm going to give you a list box which is about 100 by 300 wide. And it's just like, when am I ever going to need a list box of that size? Okay, if you right click again, reset layout all, you've now got a list box that takes up the available space. Okay. Now the interesting thing here is it hasn't just given you a list of items, it's actually given you a list of styled items in the sense that it's actually given you an image and a bit of text. So let's go in and actually look at the template that it's generated for us. Okay, so the way a list box works is it has this notion of you source it with some items, and for each of those items it's going to display based on an item template. Okay, the item template is, funnily enough, called an item template, and you'll see that this was automatically generated by Blend as we drag that sample data across. So if I edit that, you'll see that we're editing in situ. Okay, this is one of the really powerful things of Blend, is it can actually give you in situ design time support for things like lists and item templates. You can see on the right hand side that our item template is made up of a stack panel with an image and a text box, or text block. Funnily enough, that's what we can see on the screen. Now my preference is probably not for a stack panel, so let me just change that into a grid instead. So I can say change layout type grid, okay? And you'll notice that again, Blend's doing its thing. You'll notice that it's resized that grid to a height of 91 and a width of 195. Now that's going to look okay for the first item because that's approximately the size of it. If I've got an item with a lot more text, it's going to be constrained to about this width out of the whole width of the page. Okay, so realistically, I want to get rid of those constraints. Again, you get really familiar with doing reset layout. Okay, so that's going to get rid of those constraints. However, I do want to constrain it. I do want to change it up a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put the image on the left and then the text on the right-hand side. So as for my grid, I'm going to do that by specifying a couple of columns. So I'll do that. And columns and rows, for those who are not familiar with the way that XAML works, is that you can define the column, or if you're going to do rows, a number of different ways. So you can, for a column, you're specifying obviously the width, and for rows, obviously the height. And you can do those based on an absolute size. So over here, I could basically say, okay, the number of pixels I want to take up. I can specify it to be auto. Okay, so with auto, it's going to resize based on the size of the content that I've got in there. And the last one is a star. Okay, and you're thinking, okay, what's a star? If I have two columns and they are both set to star, they're going to be equal width. If I have three, they're also going to be equal width in a third of the available space. If I have two columns and one is 2 star and one is 1 star, it's not a rating system. It's a proportional system, right? So it's going to be 2 to 1, so 2/3 and 1/3. Okay, so that's how the star works. In this case, I want the image to be fixed size, so I can basically say, okay, well, I want that to be a width of 100, and my other column I'm going to leave as a star. Now, if you actually look at the XAML that's generated, you'll see that the second column, even though I left it as a star or put it as a star, it actually hasn't actually put the XAML there to specify what the width is, and that's because it's an assumed value. Okay, so it's assumed that if you don't specify the width, or in the case of a row, if you don't specify the height, it's going to be a star value. Now all we need to do is actually position our elements within those within the two columns. So again, for these, I'm going to go and reset layout on the image, and I'm going to do the same on the text block. And then the only thing I really have to do is actually move that text block out of the first column into the second column. So I do that by specifying the column property. And all of a sudden now we have the two things alongside each other. What we've got at the moment is the text is going to be hard pressed up against the image. Now, unfortunately, the design time images that they give you out of the box are actually images with a high amount of transparency on them. So when you look at this in the design surface, you'll actually see that it looks like there's a bit of space between the side of the image and actually where the text is. But if I focus on there, you can actually see that they're hard pressed up against each other. Okay? So what this means is that we should probably introduce a little bit more space. And we can do that quite easily by applying one of the built-in styles for our text block. Okay? You'll notice that, and this is one of my broken installs of Blend, where it actually doesn't show me a preview of what the style looks like. But normally what you'd see here is a preview of what each of these text styles look like. So for example, if I pick out, where is it, the accent style, it'll actually change the color of my text to be the accent style or the accent color on the phone. So users have the ability to switch between dark and light mode, and then they have an ability to specify an accent color or a theme color on the device. You can make use of that. I wouldn't recommend on every line in the list box, but you can make use of that within your application. The other styles, and in addition to specifying the color there, you'll also notice that it's actually put a margin or a border there. Okay, so it's indented the text a little bit, giving me a little bit of space. Let me just change that style to just a regular normal style. Okay, again, we've still got the margin on there, but my text is actually returned to a normal color. Now, the important things about these styles, if you're not using these styles, what you'll end up with is an application that will either have white font, which looks great in the dark theme, but that white font, when you're in the light theme, is going to be unreadable. Okay, because it's white on white. Okay, so by taking advantage of these built-in styles, I get that control out of the box. So what will happen automatically here is as the user goes between the dark theme and the light theme, my foreground color, the font color, is automatically going to change based on those styles. Okay. You can actually do that based on, if you want to explicitly set the color, you can do so over here, and some of those default colors are actually exposed here as well. So for example, if I use the phone background brush, that's going to be black in the dark theme and then white in the light theme. Okay, so you can actually take advantage of those colors by using those built-in styles. All right, let's have a look at see what this looks like at runtime. So I'll press F5, Now, the big difference between Visual Studio and Blend at runtime is that if you press F5 in Blend, it runs it, like it deploys to the emulator or deploys to the device and runs it, but it doesn't attach the debugger. Okay, so you're not going to get any of your debugger support, as developers we love, from Blend, but you will be able to at least build it and run it. So we can see our list, okay, pretty boring list, all using our design time data. Okay, so how do we turn that design time data off? Because we now want to populate it with some real data. If I go back to my data window, what you'll see here is that that checkbox that we had when we initially created our design time data has resurfaced itself just in this data window. So I can click down on this little icon here and see enable when running my application. If I uncheck that, what you'll notice on the page is that we'll see down here that it's added a d:" prefix for the data context. Okay, so now we're going into the road of data binding. Okay, so clearly, we're using data binding to bind the sample data to our user interface. And the way that we do that is we're setting the data context of the page to be that sample data. Okay? So as we go down the page, you'll see that our list box down here, the item source is data bound to the My Images property. Okay? My Images property of what? Okay? It's bound to the My Images property of the current data context. Okay, but there is no data context on the list box. That's because it's inherited. Okay, so you can either set the data context explicitly on individual elements, or it can be inherited. So if I go back up the visual tree here, you'll see I go back up to a grid. I then come all the way back up to this grid at the top here, and you can see here that the data context has been set to be the sample data cells. Okay, so if I actually toggle that option again, so I toggle that on, we'll see that that d: prefix has disappeared. All that's doing is basically, if the d: prefix is not there, it is setting the data context at runtime. Okay, so at runtime, you're going to see the design time data. If the d: prefix is there, it means it's setting that property at design time only. So that's d: prefix means design time only. So if I want to get rid of my design time data at runtime, I basically uncheck this, or I come into there and actually specify that d: prefix. Okay, so that's going to print my design time data. If I then run this now, you'll see it comes up with an empty list. Okay, great. So that's the wonderful world of Blend. Okay, let's flip back to Visual Studio and let's see if we can wire up some code to do exactly that. Now, the thing you'll notice in Visual Studio is that I don't have that design time surface. If you get the SDK out of the box, you will get a design time surface and you'll get something looking like that. It's the number one thing I always turn off on my machine for two reasons. Firstly, it's not as full-featured as the Blend design time, okay, so it doesn't do things like visual states. The second of all is, as I'm going between pages in my app, in Visual Studio, as I go between the two, if I've got my design time open here, and bearing in mind this is a relatively simple design time, okay, I've got much more complex ones when you start to deal with the panorama and the pivot and nested user controls and things like that. What you will find is that your machine grinds to a halt every time you flip between pages, because Visual Studio goes, hang on, how did I have to render that again? So if you actually turn that off, what you'll find is that you go back to some level of normality in Visual Studio again, and you can go in here and you can get IntelliSense within the XAML, and then just flip back to Blend when you need to actually do some layout stuff. Okay, so blend. Okay, get your head around it and start using that for all of the design time stuff. Okay, let's flip over to some code. And Microsoft, in their wisdom, gave you a whole bunch of commented out code. So I'm going to just get rid of that. Basically, they've added more commented code in the Windows Phone 8 templates because they want to encourage developers to think about doing globalization or localization of applications. And so they've given you some stub code to facilitate that. So around things like application resources and around the use of application bars using some localized content. Okay, so unfortunately, it means that for the likes of me, who doesn't do very much localized stuff, I end up having to delete that all out. The other thing I'm doing is that if you don't already use ReSharper or another refactoring tool, I'd highly recommend it. I find ReSharper particularly good at pointing out my flaws, and trust me, I've got a lot of them when it comes to writing code. It's really good at cleaning up my code. So if I write, an if-then-else statement that's, gratuitous or too verbose, it goes, you know what, you could really tidy this up. Okay, so and in this case, all of these using statements are somewhat superfluous, so I can go Alt-Enter and get rid of those. Okay, all of a sudden my code file is looking a lot cleaner. It means that anybody can jump in here and go, okay, well, I don't have lines and lines of unnecessary code. I can see exactly what this page is doing. And what is this page doing? Well, absolutely nothing at the moment. Okay, so I'm going to override the onNavigate method. Okay, so a quick discussion about lifecycle of pages in a Windows Phone application. As we arrive at a page, we get an onNavigated_to method invoked on the page, and when we leave a page, irrespective of where we're going, whether it's another page in our application or we're going off to another application on the device, we'll always get an onNavigated_from called. Okay, so this makes a perfect opportunity to load or unload data on our page. And so I would encourage you to get out of the habit of tying code to the loaded event on a page. Okay, so it's a big no-no in Windows Phone land. You're better off running code from the onNavigated_to when you actually arrive at the page. Onloaded is great for doing one-off actions, but most of the time you'll need to do a lot more parsing in terms of dealing with when the user comes back to the page from another application, because you'll get the onNavigated_to wherever they're coming from, as opposed to the loaded, which you'll only get once. Okay, so as the page gets created, you'll get it once. And there's a lot more lifecycle discussion we could have around the use of these methods. So anyway, we're going to do some code in the onNavigated_to, and interesting, what we're going to do is we're actually going to load up a URL for some content coming from Flickr. So let me just actually find the URL that I want. And so there's a simple line. It's basically it's one of the public feeds for Flickr, and for those who haven't seen Fiddler before, it's great to basically looking at HTTP traffic. Okay, I apologize, it's quite small, but this is basically our JSON feed from Flickr, and it's got a series of items that's going to come back when we make that web request. Okay, I'm literally doing this as a sample to show how easy it is to pull down content and have it display in the UI that we've just built in Blend. Unfortunately, this all comes down in JSON, and actually I need it represented as objects that I can then data bind. Okay, there's a really quick way of actually getting that conversion, so I can come into here and basically go, okay, let me grab my JSON, like so, and I'm going to go out to the web for a second, and we're going to go to JSON to C#.com. And this is a really simple tool, but it's really good for taking JSON and generating our class libraries. Okay, so I'm just going to copy that code, flip back to Visual Studio, and I'm going to drop this in the bottom here, and that's going to give me a class library or class hierarchy that basically represents the content of that feed. Okay, and you can see that it's got familiar properties in there. Of course, we're then going to have to get that request, so I'm going to make this an async method. We're going to create a request. And let me just grab that URL again. Oop, not the class library. I'll grab the right thing. There we go. Okay, what I will do for the benefit of everyone is just change the font size so we can all see it. Hopefully that's a little bit more legible. Okay, so we have our request. We're going to invoke that request to get back a response, and I'm going to do that in a sort of an asynchronous manner. So I'm going to do var response equals await task dot, yes, give me a reference to the task library, task.factory.from async, and we're going to type that as a request web response, and we're going to do request.begin get response, request.end get response. And if you've been working with Windows 8 and you think, why isn't he using the HTTP client? It doesn't exist on Windows Phone 8, so we're stuck using web requests or the web client. So we do have to proxy it and essentially wrap the asynchronous methods, so begin get response and end get response, in this sort of asynchronous wrapper. So this is actually going to give us a response. Okay, the next thing to do is actually convert that back into the JSON that we need. Okay, so we're going to do grab a serializer. And that's a type. Whoop. And it got created as a root object. Okay, so the root object is what I just created down here. So that was the object that came back from that JSON to C#. And we're going to create a serializer based on that. And then of course we're going to have a stream. So using stream equals response dot get response stream, and then we do serializer dot read object, okay, and pass it the stream. So this is going to give us our root object back. And I'm literally doing this to make sure that I haven't made any boo-boos along the way. So let me put a breakpoint there and actually run this up in the emulator. How many people reckon this is going to work? How many people have been reading my code? Okay. Bang. Okay, it whinges because it's going to say read is not supported on the main thread when buffering is disabled. Okay, I would have thought that I am on the main thread and that things should go according to plan. Unfortunately, that's not. I do need an additional property in the top here, which is on my request, I need to say allow read stream buffering equals true. That was a trick. And one that I always fall for. All right, okay, so we have our root object, and hopefully if we break this down, we actually look and it's serialized according to what's come back from that JSON feed, okay? Now, I could rename everything in here and then have to wire it up according, rename things so that they marry up with the properties that I've got in Blend. The other thing I could do is go, okay, well, actually, what are my properties called down here? Okay, so I've got a root object and it's got a collection of items called items, okay? Let's go back to Blend, and it's down here, and say, okay, well, my property is called my images, and let's change this to items. Okay, so that marries up with the items property. Okay, the next thing we've got is down here in our, so we've got a collection of items. Okay, so let's go back up to our items. Rather than a title with a capital T, we've now got a title with a lowercase t. So let's go and correct that in Blend. Okay, and interesting enough, it hasn't sorted itself out there. There you go. And then the last thing is the image URL. Okay, well, actually, we don't have an image URL here. What we've got is a media object that's got an M property on it. Okay, well, let's do this an alternative way. Rather than renaming it in Blend, let's actually create another property in here that's actually going to marry up with that. So we're going to go public image URL, string image URL. And the getter on this is going to return media.m. Okay, so in theory, what we've got is we've married up the Blend, properties with what's available in Visual Studio. Let's go and make sure we've saved all of this. I'll override the XAML. And so the last thing we need to do is actually set the data context of the current page equal to our root object. Voila. Okay. Not bad, huh? So design all the way through to actually stuff appearing on the screen in very few minutes, okay? And with very few demo screw-ups. Fantastic. Right, okay, let's go back to our slides for a second. Okay, so tools. Okay, obviously Visual Studio and Blend for Visual Studio are probably the most important of those tools. You also saw the Windows Phone emulator that popped up, and that's particularly good for debugging. Unfortunately, some of the issues associated with the use of the tools for particularly around Windows Phone 8 is to do with the emulator. Okay, so there's a number of known issues. The number one being is I don't have Hyper-V installed on my machine. That's because you're probably not running Windows 8 Pro. And so you need to have Windows 8 Pro in order to run the emulator, okay? You don't need it in order to run the DevTools, but you do need Windows 8 to run the DevTools. So in order to run the emulator, you do need Hyper-V enabled and turned on, and the follow-on from that is that it also messes with your networking stack. And so if you're using things like VPN clients and things like that, then chances are it's going to mess with those as well. So there are a lot of gotchas around those. For example, I've got two wireless networks at home. The tools and everything works beautifully on one, and these networks are virtually identical. I go to the other network and the tools don't work with them. Right? I can't get an external network address on the other network. So there are a couple of nuances around the emulator and the DevTools. That said, the emulators are quite good. They're available for all of the different screen resolutions we've got. They do spin up and down very quickly because they are literally, once the image has been created in Hyper-V, they just take snapshots of them. So every time you open and close the emulator, it generates us a snapshot and a sort of differential disk based on those. So it does become very quick to use and spin up the emulator each time. The other thing about the emulator is it is essentially a full build of Windows Phone. Okay, so nearly all of the apps are there. You can go and browse through them and have a look. The core apps on the platform, that is, not the ones in the store. You've also got some additional tools like the simulation dashboard. So for example, with the simulation dashboard, and I'll flip over to Visual Studio and show that, simulation dashboard, we can actually control or simulate different network conditions. Okay, so rather than having to run it on a real device and walk in and out of cell locations or Wi-Fi networks, you can actually control that using the emulator, using the simulation dashboard. You can also trigger the lock screen. Okay, so there is a keyboard shortcut, I think it's like F9 or something on the emulator that'll actually trigger the lock screen as well, but you can do that from the simulation dashboard. And lastly, we've got the ability to trigger reminders on there. Okay, so particularly good if you're a games developer and you want to test how your application behaves when parts of the screen are obscured. There's an obscured event that gets raised in the framework, and you can use the trigger reminder to test that. The other tools is off the emulator. There's a set of additional tools. So this additional tools window. So you can see that we can mess with the accelerometer. So we can actually literally drag this cursor around to give it different accelerometer values. We can test different location values. So I can literally scroll this map and actually get change of location appearing in the emulator. I can take screenshots. This is particularly useful if you're going to submit apps to the store where you need to grab screenshots. You can actually generate them using this tool. The word of advice here is that make sure you generate the screenshots with the highest res emulator, because that way they'll automatically scale them for the other resolutions. Okay. Otherwise, you'll be sitting there going, okay, well I've got the the 480 by 800 ones, I've got the 720p ones, I've got this ones, right? Actually, you don't need to do any of that. You just need the ones on the highest res, and if you upload those, they'll automatically convert them to the lower res for you. And lastly, there's a network tab, and this tab was introduced in Windows Phone 8 and it's completely useless other than telling you that you have a network connection, which is usually pretty evident because you can go to Internet Explorer and see whether you've got a network connection. But in case you're wondering, it does give you the IP addresses on all three of them. So I'm pretty certain that this was a useful internal debugging tool, and they thought that it would be meaningful to most people. It's not. The other tools that are available are the developer registration tool. So if you have a real device, one of the tools that comes with the SDK is the ability to unlock that device so that you can push out a developer build or hit F5 and run in Visual Studio. Prior to that, it'll actually come up and say your device is currently locked. It doesn't give you the ability to download applications from the store and sideload it. Unencrypted, that is. It does give you the ability to push out applications from the dev tools. There is also an application deployment tool, which is good if somebody's given you a dev zap and you want to push it to either the emulator or to the device without having to load Visual Studio. Those tools, you use them once and then your device is unlocked, so you don't need to use them again. The last one here is the Isolated Storage Explorer tool. This is particularly good for getting data off your device so that you can see which files you've been reading and writing to. So for example, particularly if you're doing a lot of work with, say, SQLite or SQL, Link to SQL, quite often your database will be at a format where you're thinking, okay, well, I don't know whether this record exists or doesn't exist, or my application's failing under these conditions. This tool is particularly good for actually getting a copy of everything that's in isolated storage for your application. You can take a dump of that and actually take a look at what's available in that folder. Okay. And actually, I did have a demo of this, but let's actually go out and I will do command line. It's not a very interesting demo, but it's worth doing so that you know where the tools are. CD Microsoft. It's in the SDKs, CD Windows, not the Azure one. And there's like multiple versions of the SDKs in there now. So CD Tools, CD Isolated Storage Explorer tool. And if we go ICE tool, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of help documentation that goes with it. And essentially you're taking a snapshot or you're restoring a snapshot to isolated storage. So the parameters here are ICE tool, the first parameter is take a snapshot, so TS or restore a snapshot. So we're going to take a snapshot first. we're going to, the next parameter is whether you're targeting the device or targeting the emulator. So XD for the emulator and DE for a real device. And actually, if you've got multiple devices attached or you've got multiple emulators opening, then you can actually specify the device index of those as well. We've only got one, so I'll do XD. The next property is the product ID. So the immediate thought that comes to mind is, okay, well, doesn't that mean that I can use this tool to grab all of the local content for like the Facebook app or the LinkedIn app? And it's like, no, you can't. This tool doesn't work for store applications. So applications that have been installed from the store, you can't use this tool against them, even if you happen to know what the product ID is for that app. In this case, let me come over here to Visual Studio. If I go down to Properties, and there's this WM app manifest file, and if I double click on that, you'll see a nice little designer. If I go to the Packaging tab, I can grab out my product ID, excluding the curly brackets, like so. Come back to my command line and I'll drop that in just by pasting it. And then the last property I need to provide here is the output folder, the folder on my host machine that I want to take the snapshot to. So I'm going to do ctemp ISO export, and you'll see that it comes back with done. If I open that up, it's not very interesting. It's literally a copy of an empty isolated store. So you can see that there's a couple of folders that are created by default, and these are for sharing content with the media player, going out to the specified tiles for the live tiles, so shell content, and then background transfer. So if you're doing transfer, like large file transfers, they end up in the files transfer folder. These folders are somewhat special to Windows Phone. It's the only part of isolated storage that's actually not very isolated. So those folders are actually parts of the operating system can access files in there, so they can either put files in there or read files from there. Everywhere else in isolated storage is literally restricted to your application only. If I wanted to make a change to any of these files, so for example, I could create a text file in here, new text file, like that. I could then push that file back into the emulator by actually calling the restore on here. Now the trick to this, so I've obviously got to change TS to RS for restore. The trick on the end of here is that I need to append isolated store on there, because you'll notice that it created a subfolder off here called isolated store, which is quite friendly of it, because it meant if I had other stuff in that folder, it's not going to pollute all of that. But when it comes to restoring it, I have to actually give it that subfolder to restore it back. So if I execute that, you'll find that there's no way of browsing to see what's on there, but yeah, you can assume that file has been then restored there and it's available to my application. This is particularly good for regression testing or regression debugging your application. So if you've got a known condition that happens at a particular time, you can pull off the contents of isolated store, you can put it against a work item and say, here's the problem, right? This is the steps to reproduce it. Restore snapshot, run the application, it breaks at this point. Okay, so it means that you've got definitive reproduction steps. So make sure your testers are aware of that facility, because it can really help you when you're actually trying to work out the source of a problem. Some third-party tools. Obviously, I've talked about ReSharper already. In terms of third-party controls, Telerik, Infragistics, all the main controller vendors now have Windows Phone controls. There's some other ones like Buddy and Push.io that provide sort of more back-end infrastructure services. Those are all worth looking at. The one that I've been using quite a bit recently, it's still in sort of preview state at the moment, is Azure Mobile Services. And this is quite good because it gives you, out of the box, it basically gives you providers for doing authentication against Microsoft account, Google, Facebook and Twitter. Okay, so you don't have to mess around with doing OAuth 1 and OAuth 2 to connect to all of these providers. You can literally drag in a control and it's done. Okay, so it's really simple to get that stuff up and running. And that's one thing that these other sort of third-party providers actually don't have. Okay, so that's a really good staging point for just getting that authentication stuff happening within your application. They also provide some back-end infrastructure around sending emails to bulk emails out and doing things like sending push notifications out to the devices as well. Now that you've successfully built your application, of course, you're going to think about submitting it to the Windows Phone store. Interesting enough, actually, a lot of the scenarios that I'm dealing with at the moment are not based around store-based applications. With Windows Phone 8, we've now got the ability to do enterprise deployment of applications. So devices can actually be enrolled in the enterprise. So you can have a mobile management system that actually can be used to push out applications within the enterprise. Okay, so you can literally build up an internal application. You can sign it using an enterprise certificate, and then you can deploy it within your enterprise without having to get it reviewed and certified through the store and without it being available on a public marketplace. So a number of scenarios that I'm dealing with at the moment are actually going that route as opposed to going through the public store. If you do go through the store, you do need to be aware that there's a number of content and technical policies that you do need to adhere to. These are all very well documented online, so I would advise you to take advantage of reading through those. They are reasonably good at providing feedback when you do fail against them, and I do say when because chances are your first application will fail. And don't take it to heart. It's just matter of learning the nuances of the store certification process. The things that they typically test for are correct use of the back button. So don't use the back button to erase contents in a text box. That's not what it's there for. They'll make sure that obviously you've got content policies, and there's things like if you use location within your application, you need to have a checkbox or a toggle switch to enable or disable location. The same is true of push notifications. You've got to have a toggle there for enabling or disabling it. There are various conditions around if you're using location, if you're tracking location or you're sending location off to a third-party service, it needs to be opt-in. There's a whole bunch of those different policies that you need to be aware of, but once you're aware of them, then you'll just do them as a matter of course. Okay, I think I actually had my first application successfully published the first time it went through the store the other day. I was like, woo, because I always expected to come back 3 days later and say, no, you failed for this particular policy that's changed 2 weeks ago. It's like, great, how was I supposed to know? Yeah, they do change over time, so don't be surprised if they catch you. The good thing about the store is the cert process is actually relatively quick in the scheme of things. So we're at about somewhere between 2 and 4 days to get an application certified and published and available in the store. So that's significantly quicker than some of the other platforms. Bearing in mind that they do some fairly rigorous quality verification.
I've got an online question.
Sure.
Is there a visual tool for isolated storage? I've found one for Windows Phone 7 only. So he's obviously asking, do they have one for
there
Windows
is.
Phone 8?
Let me see if I've got it installed.
And the one for Windows Phone 7 is wp7explorer.codeplex.com.
Yes, so that's actually a legacy tool and actually requires you to install something actually into your application in order for it to work, I think, if it's the same one that I'm thinking about. There is a WP Power Tools, and this actually does allow you to probe into isolated storage. So I'll just demonstrate that now. So if I pick up the same emulator that I've currently got running, and I hit connect, I think that I can then go to isolated storage. Yeah, so isolated storage, I can then browse the contents of isolated storage. So funnily enough, that was the text file that I just uploaded into it, or I restored to it, is funnily enough there. What do you know? Good-o. So yeah, you can use this tool, and that's actually quite a nice way of actually browsing the contents of it as well. So I can double click on these and open the contents of those files as well. So yep, great question from online. There is one, it's called WP Power Tools. Yes?
You said that they change their policies a lot.
I didn't say they change them a lot, but they do change them.
Okay, so if they change, what happens to the applications that already pass certified according to the old policies?
So unless, so I'll rephrase the question. Yep. So the question was, what happens if a content policy or a technical policy changes to apps that have already passed certification? Unless it's something very harsh, where they're making a massive change to the way that the store is going to work, which I haven't seen in the entire time it's been, they don't make any changes to existing apps. The only time that they then enforce those policies are if you then submit an update. So you go through that certification process, and what's worse is they tend to look for the things that they've changed. So, for example, if your application would fail a particular policy, they'll actually go and check for those specific policies. So the certification process, they're pretty good at providing feedback about what you failed on, so they don't just give you a fail report and leave you to work out what you actually did wrong. They're pretty good at providing those. And they've also built out this store test kit. So and within Visual Studio, you can bring up this test kit, and there's a number of different tests that you can go through and actually run to try to make sure that you've got the best chance possible of making sure you submit the first time. So there's some things around application details, so making sure you have appropriate screenshots or that you have an application icon that isn't the default application icon. And there's some automated tests here, so these you can see here that I'm failing, that I haven't specified some icons and some screenshots for my application. But the package validates correctly, okay? You'd expect it to unless you've been messing with it. there's a bunch of manual tests, and by manual tests, what they mean is that they've gone through the content and the technical policies, and they basically tried to give you an example of the type of test that they run or the type of steps that they go through as part of that certification process. So you don't get any surprises, and they go, well, why did you do that? Okay, so the idea is that you get an example of what they do as part of that testing process. They've also added this tool called the application analysis tool, and this allows you to basically run up your application and get an idea of startup time, responsiveness, so whether the UI locks up or freezes for whatever reason. It also covers things like the amount of data that's uploaded and downloaded by your application. They say battery charge remaining. Actually, what they're doing, they're trying to give you a relative measure of how much battery your application is going to chew through. So if you've got a particularly CPU intensive application, it's obviously going to chew through more of your battery life than a standard Facebook app, for example. It looks at the maximum memory used. Okay, so remembering that we've actually got a hard upper ceiling for the amount of memory that your application can use. If you use beyond that, your application will get terminated. And it gives you an average memory used as well. Okay, so you can see that graphically. And this is particularly good for over time looking at how your application has degraded in performance. Notice that I've said degraded because most applications, if we start to pile features on, our application goes from an immediate startup to starting up with 5 to 10 to 20 seconds, okay? Try to keep the same performance metrics for your application as you go forward. So the earlier you start to run this analysis tool in your dev cycle and keep an idea of what the metrics are for it, that you can actually monitor those over time. So if somebody adds some code that's going to go and poll a service every 30 seconds, you can immediately pick that up and say, okay, well, that's going to be really bad for battery life. It's going to be really bad for the amount of data that's downloaded by our application. Okay, Windows versus Windows Phone. So the good news is that it is all XAML and C#. Okay, so our dev skills we don't have to learn yet another platform. Okay, we don't need to learn another technology. I'll put it that way. We don't need to learn another syntax because the XAML is roughly the same syntax, the C#'s the same syntax. The UI for Windows 8 is a little bit different from Windows Phone. It doesn't have any of the nice built-in controls like the panorama or the pivot control. So there's a lot more of custom XAML that we have to do to get the same look and feel as the core platform. There are also other applications for Windows that are written in HTML, JavaScript, or in native code. We do have native code support on Windows Phone as well, so you can have cross-platform stuff in native code if you want. There's no HTML, JavaScript application type for Windows Phone, so if you're going to write the core of your application in web technologies, you can do so, but you need to probably look at some sort of framework like PhoneGap or something like that to actually embed your application within a native package. Okay. The XAML isn't really compatible between Windows and Windows Phone for a number of reasons. Firstly, the controls are different. Okay, so and there's some basic ones that are the same, so buttons and text block and things like that. But once we start getting into things like list pickers and long list selectors and panorama and pivot controls, currently those controls are vastly different between the two platforms. There's no grid view or list view on Windows Phone. We have a list box, we have a long list selector. Okay, there's no list picker on Windows 8. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of those things where there's an incompatibility between controls. The way that namespaces are declared in XAML is different between Windows and Windows Phone. So even if you wanted to just share resources like color dictionaries and things like that, you'll find that you won't be able to share the XAML file, okay, because of the namespace changes. And lastly, the embedded resource format has also changed. There's like a resx format for Windows Phone and then a resw format for Windows. Okay, so again, compatibility differences between the two. There's also API differences between the two. This is one area where there is some compatibility. Windows Phone's got this kind of weird hybrid model at the moment where we have a whole bunch of legacy Silverlight style APIs. So for example, accessing local storage is done through isolated storage APIs. Or we can do them via the Windows storage APIs. Okay, so those are the new Windows RT APIs for accessing that stuff. So for compatibility, you'd go that route because that would mean that you could have the same code for Windows and Windows Phone. Okay. The nice thing about Windows Phone is that you can pick between the two. If you're more comfortable in one, you can go with those. And actually, interesting. That's one example where the Windows Phone way, all of the isolated storage APIs are all synchronous. Okay. So you call it. So you say open file, and your line of code basically blocks at that point, which will block your UI if you're not on a background thread. the Windows RT APIs are all async event or async operations, right? So you can have that in the event handler for a code behind for a button, and you can block at that point when the file, whilst the file's been opened, without blocking the user interface. Okay, so there's just some subtle differences between the way that those two APIs work. The good news is there is some common ground. Okay, so the Portable Class Library project is a good way of sharing resources between Windows and Windows Phone. Failing that, we can share classes between them. So literally sharing the class files between Windows and Windows Phone projects. We can also use partial classes. Okay, so there might be a code block that we want to share between the two projects. So we can actually have that code file actually included in both projects, and then we can have a secondary file that augments that class with some additional properties or additional methods that are specific to either Windows or Windows Phone. So that's just one strategy for doing that. Okay, I can do a demo later on. I just want to step over this and just talk about the sort of the more wider cross-platform story, of which Windows and Windows Phone is just a subset of this bigger story. Okay. And I've broken this into two sort of dimensions. Basically, it becomes a decision as whether you want to do raw native development on one end of the spectrum. So, building Objective-C for iOS, building in Java and native code for Android, or building in .NET for Windows Phone. On the other end of the spectrum, you can go ahead and build on a regular website, okay, and just do responsive layout for when it's run on Windows Phone, iOS, Android, whatever. Okay. The reality is, if you look at the bottom, this equates to either a great user experience. Well, assuming that you have good designers and you've actually got a dev team that know what they're doing on one end of the spectrum. And then on the website side, you have a slow, laggy, unresponsive, nasty user interface that only works when you're online. Did I say enough negative things about web development? Adam will get me later. Right. The good news is that it's not all bad when it comes to web development. There are some very hybrid things that we can do to make it a slightly better user experience. Okay. The number one thing I don't like about websites is they've got absolutely no tie-in to my device. Okay. So they don't know where I am. Well, increasingly they can do, because they can be geolocation aware. They've got no tie into the camera, the pictures, anything else to, the accelerometer, anything else on my device. Okay. If we take those websites and we start building them out as more like applications, we can start to ingest some of those capabilities. Now, clearly, from websites, we can build HTML5 apps that's literally just a one-page web app, okay? Those behave a lot better because they're designed with the user experience in mind, okay? So they basically serve up one page, and then everything's done to basically pull down data from a service and then render it differently on the client side. So a lot of the work is done client side, which ends up being a much nicer user experience. And increasingly, that's the direction that we're seeing most web development going now anyhow. Even if they're not doing single page, they are doing a lot of more dynamic, serving up data and changing the UI on the fly, rather than having to do a post back and a full page refresh every time. If we then take that HTML5 app and actually go down and actually wrap that in a native application, so now we've got a native application with the HTML5 app sitting inside it, what we have there is something that we can list on the store. We've got something that can reach out from our HTML5 app into the device and actually access things like the camera and other device-based capabilities. Okay. Now, clearly, you can build all of that wrapper yourself. Some clever people have actually decided, okay, well, rather than everyone having to build it individually for every single application they build, why don't we build a concept that can actually provide that out of the box? Okay, so that's the direction the guys at PhoneGap, and there's a number of other frameworks that do very similar sort of things do. And so out of the box with PhoneGap, you basically get this wrapped experience. You're going to serve up predominantly HTML5 content within this sort of wrapped experience. Now, going even further, then there's some people like the guys from Dev Express that have got this concept called DXstream. I think it's still in beta, but it's basically taking that whole concept of PhoneGap and saying, okay, well, nobody really wants to have to build things, line by line in Notepad. Let's give them a designer experience. Okay, so it's about bringing that experience back into Visual Studio and improving the development experience around it. Okay, so underneath the hood, they still use PhoneGap. Okay, so they give you that cross-platform capability by rendering up a HTML-based application, but they wrap it in a nice way so that you've got data binding using Knockout.js, and they've got a number of other nice UI features built into the plugin to Visual Studio that make it a lot easier and a lot quicker to build applications that way. As we go further towards building native applications, we've then got the stuff from Xamarin, so MonoTouch and MonoDroid. And essentially what we've got here is the ability to take our C# code and write it against the designer stuff for iOS or Android. So you're typically still building the design part of it using Interface Builder, or what's now embedded into Xcode. So you still lay things out using that, or you still use Eclipse to do the layout for Android. But you can tie in your C# code into those. So they do the cross-compilation to actually generate your native application. So the end product for those is actually your native experience. The nice thing for us .NET guys is that when we're targeting Windows Phone and Windows 8, we don't have to do any of those. We don't need any other tools. But then when we go to reach out to those other platforms, the tools from Xamarin really help us along the way there. So what does Xamarin offer? Okay, so historically they've offered a product called MonoTouch. This is where they really started in terms of this cross-platform support. So MonoTouch is very mature, it's very sophisticated, and it virtually, as Apple released new APIs and things like that, they take them on, they wrap them, they expose them as part of this toolkit. So there's virtually nothing you can't actually do in MonoTouch, and if there is, then you can go and build a native iOS component in Objective-C and then reach into it from your MonoTouch project. Okay, so there's no constraints as far as I'm aware of to actually building a MonoTouch application over building a native Objective-C. Okay, they've also they're now into like the second or third iteration of Mono for Android, also known as MonoDroid. And again, they're going down that path of wrapping anything or the APIs that get surfaced. And actually, their installer is incredibly insane for these things. So literally, it's a one-click installer to give you all of the dev tools you need and all the plugins you need for Visual Studio. Visual Studio for iOS. Interesting concept. Their latest announcement about a month ago was that they've now got Visual Studio integrated support for building iOS applications. And you're thinking, how on earth does Apple let them do that? The downside of this is that you need a dumb Apple box sitting in a corner that acts as a build server. Okay, so you do all your development in C# in Visual Studio. This plugin, when you hit build, goes out, connects to the dumb Apple machine you've got sitting in the corner, runs the build, which is about all it's good for, and spits you back an application that's going to run on your iOS device. Beautiful. Okay, Adam.
To be clear, you don't need an Apple box. They do that job for you.
No, you do need an Apple box. Yes.
I thought they did that job for you.
I don't know that they've got a service online that they've got.
You need to have Xcode.
Yeah, you need to have Xcode running on a box somewhere that's reachable from your machine. Yep. But the actual reaching out to that box is done by them. Okay.
And also to debug and to deploy to a device, to develop the device, you still need the application.
Yes. So
you do it from the Xamarin Studio, from Apple itself, Mac itself, and run it.
Yeah, so the point here is that in order to do the deployment to a real device and to debug it on in the simulator, you do need a real device, like you need an Apple box connected with Xcode to a real device that you're then going to debug on. So yes, you don't get away with that. You can't debug from Visual Studio into a device plugged into your machine, unfortunately. They're getting pretty close, but they're not quite.
The Xamarin Studio looks extremely alike Visual Studio.
Yes, so the point is there's actually two things here. There's actually Xamarin Studio, which is their own proprietary sort of development environment, but all of that capability is also plugged into Visual Studio. So if you've already got a Visual Studio license, you can actually use their plugin as part of that. If you don't have Visual Studio, you can still use all of their dev kit, but you just use Xamarin Studio. Okay. Now this is a paid-for tool, but it's worth every single penny if you're going to do cross-platform development and you're a C# guy. So. With that, that's pretty much it for the evening. There's my contact details, roughly everything you need to know about me. Awesome, thanks very much.